Historian Jay Winik first appeared on the Booknotes television program 24 years ago to discuss his book, April 1865. It became a #1 New York Times bestseller, reportedly read by Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, George W. Bush, and many others. It's the narrative story of the Civil War. For his latest book, Winik stepped back 4 years in history to look at how the Civil War began. This time, the book is titled 1861, The Lost Peace. Northerners had little regard for the strength or determination of the South, writes Winik. Lincoln friend John Hay said the Southern Army was nothing more than a vast mob. The New York Tribune said it differently. Jeff Davis and company will be swinging from the battlements at Washington by the 4th of July.
This summer, honor your democracy hero and ignite C-SPAN's America 250 coverage, our 18-month ad-free celebration of our nation's story. Give $25 or more by August 31st at cspan.org/donate to add the person who first showed you democracy in action to our Democracy Hero wall. We'll thank you with a C-SPAN decal. Your gift keeps these stories alive nationwide. Donate today at cspan.org/donate. Thank you.
Jay Winik, in your book, 1861, you make the following points about March 4th, 1860, Inauguration Day for Abraham Lincoln. 1861, Inauguration Day. You say that James Buchanan was worn out, that Stephen Douglas was dying, that Jefferson Davis was sickly, and Abraham Lincoln was drained. What did that mean on that day? Why did you focus on that?
Well, I focused on that because I was trying to make the point that our leaders were exhausted and worn and weary, and they could barely carry on from day to day, let alone preside over the momentous question of whether or not to go to war or maintain a peace. And it's interesting to look at these different leaders. James Buchanan, he met a retinue of senators from the Willard Hotel. They came over Pennsylvania Avenue. They rapped on the door, and Buchanan came out. He was wearing a long nightshirt, and there were bags under his eyes, and he just looked so haggard. And that embodied sort of the spirit of how difficult this task was of forging the peace and maintaining the peace. And that was what the great question was at the time. And it's a question that largely has been lost to history. I mean, history, as typically rendered, it basically says that it was a foregone conclusion that there would be no war. And in fact, there was a war. There was a war that consumed 750,000 lives and was the most titanic struggle that this country had ever fought. And so you have the picture of this ailing Jefferson Davis, this picture of this ailing Buchanan, you have Abraham Lincoln ailing, and some out of all this, they would fight this war of a magnitude that no one had ever imagined could be fought.
It may be a simple question, but why was Lincoln drained?
Lincoln was drained because he was in a situation of what was he to do? Now, imagine who Lincoln is at this point, and not the Lincoln we know of him as today, but the Lincoln of his time and his era. Lincoln had never presided over a war. He had never commanded troops. He had never held an office, such as being senator or a diplomat. So Lincoln really was sort of starting from ground zero. And I think it's important to realize that Lincoln was untested, and he was largely just coming to this and making a policy ad hoc. And I think it's important that the American people know that he didn't come down as a saint from the heavens, citing the Gettysburg Address, but he was a man trying to combat the views of him where he was viewed as a monkey, as a baboon, as a country lawyer, as a hick. And that was those were comments from his own cabinet, let alone his own enemies. So I think it's important to sort of see Lincoln as he was in his day and age, not as he's become in history today.
You do say in your book, you give a story in your book about Jefferson Davis and his wife. What was that about?
It's almost hard to fathom how poignant it is. But what happened was when he learned that he was going to be the president of the Confederacy, his wife Verena was in the living room, and she heard this crying coming from the dining room, and she walked into the dining room. The lights were dimmed, and it was Jeff Davis sobbing because he knew about the Armageddon to come if they go to war, and he hated the thought of that.
At that moment on that inauguration day, what percentage of people thought we were going to go to war with the Civil War, and what thought we were going to be able to have some kind of peace?
Well, this is in some ways kind of the heart of the question that I ask in The Lost Peace. And what it does ask is how many of the American people, if given the opportunity to vote on that one question, would have said yes to war. I mean, the war consumed some 750,000 lives, a terrible tragedy of blood and tears. And the fact is that most Americans, they didn't want war. They didn't want this kind of bloodshed. They would have easily and much more readily have opted for peace and let slavery die a natural death over time. And what's sort of fascinating is that, again, as much as Lincoln is seen as a cosmic thinker, a great strategist, a man seeing deep into the future, never in his debates with his cabinet did he ask the question, what would the consequences be if we go to war? How many people would it affect? How many people would die? Now, these are basic questions that are asked in the 20th century or 21st century when getting ready to go to war. But Lincoln never asked at all, what would the consequences be if we do go to war?
It's hard to believe, but the last time I talked with you was 24 years ago. And it was for your book, April 1865. And how would you characterize the difference of your attitude toward writing April 1865, which was the #1 book bestseller, and this book, 1861? What's the difference in your thinking those two times?
I think the difference in my thinking is that when I wrote April 1865, I mean, that was a book where everything came together. The book was a runaway #1 bestseller. It's still widely read today. People read it and consider it one of the finest works of history that they've read in decades. Just everything fit and came together, as I said. Now with 1861, The Lost Peace, I sort of flipped the script in a sense. In essence, what we have and what I've done is they're bookends of the same question. One bookend is about how the war ended and the consequences and fears and concerns then, the threat of guerrilla war, which America could have descended into upon the surrender of the Confederacy. And then in The Lost Peace, it asks another major question. I mean, one of the things I do in my work is just by whatever quirk of fate, I ask questions that most historians sort of overlook or don't mine very carefully. The Lost Peace asked, I think, probably the most fundamental question in the life of this nation. If we had decided not to go to war, we would have saved all those lives, all those men. And it's likely that slavery would have died and seen its own demise simply by the ebb and flow of time. In the Lost Peace, and again, it asks this fateful question: What would it have taken to keep the peace? Why did we lose the peace? What went wrong? And these are key questions that I've tried to restore to life.
When did you start this book?
Well, typically I take 4 years to write a book, and that rarely changes. This book was different. It took considerably longer, and in part that's because I got Parkinson in the course of it, and I sort of hesitate to say that openly, but I think it's critical to note. Yeah, so that's what I'd say.
I did notice that when you were at Politics and Prose at the end of your talk, Evan Thomas mentioned that you had Parkinson's. Did you guys agree to that before? And I don't care whether you did or didn't, but it'd be interesting for you to tell us what impact having Parkinson's has on you to be able to research and write.
Right. It's funny. Evan thought it was important that I let people know that I have this finicky disease. I'll call it that, or this insidious disease. So he thought we should say something about it. He thought I should say something about it as one of the leading historians in the nation, that I kind of come clean about what could be affecting my writing. But Evan thought I would say something. I didn't, so he said it, and it was a very touching moment for me personally, where people, they had tears in their eyes and they clapped for me, sort of in a sense of saying, you may have this awful disease, but you're fighting a good fight as well. It does affect my writing and my research. And this may be my last book.
At what point in this book's preparation did you get Parkinson?
I'm not sure. I think it was probably 15 years ago. And I sort of measured it by my tennis game. I had once played tennis at Yale, so I was a good player, and I loved playing with my kids. And I figured as long as I could hit it with my kids, I'm doing okay. But things kind of worsened over time, and like a guy's guy, I kind of ignored it. But eventually, it got to a point where, well, I'm going to be very vivid here, and I've never done this before. But I woke up one morning, got out of bed, and I couldn't move. And I sort of stood there, and I was frozen. And so that's when I knew I had to see a neurologist. They made the determination that I have this disease, and I made a decision not to tell anyone about it at the time. Later, when I told my kids, they said they wished they had known earlier, and I should have told them. But it affects me because it affects the body in all sorts of ways. But my message to those who have this disease is fight the good fight. You can be a productive citizen. You can continue to work. You can continue to contribute. You can do all sorts of things. It won't be as easy or as simple, but it's every bit as necessary and every bit as doable. And life is for the living. And so I embrace the idea of keep on living.
Tell us about your friendship with the person that writes the introduction to this book, Evan Thomas. When did that start, and what impact did that have on this book, for instance?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brian. Evan and I have been friends for many years, and we would go for lunch once a month and sit down, and we'd gossip about Washington. We'd gossip about you. We'd gossip about Walter Isaacson. Ooh, I shouldn't have said that. Okay, Meacham, I'll say we gossiped about you. But we had a lot of fun. And, Evan loves my style of writing. And he would come to lunch. He'd have one of my books, and there'd be yellow stickies all put up through it. And he'd say, "How'd you do this? How'd you do that?" Because my writing style is different. I write like a poem. Short sentences, long sentences, difficult words, simple words. I try to really bring things to life. But so with Evan, we had been friends for a long, long time. And then when I got the disease, I told him about it, and it turned out his father had MS, so he was very familiar with it. And so we've been having lunch at the Chevy Chase Club ever since. And it's not always easy. I remember one day we went over to Chevy, and we were walking in the door, and I fell flat on my face, and that would have freaked some people out who were timid writers, but not Evan. He helped get me up, and we continued a nice 2-hour lunch. So Evan has been a friend as a writer. He's a wonderful writer, easily one of our finest in the nation. And he's a friend as a comrade. His wife Osi, who does all her work with him, they collaborate intensely. She and I are very close, and she's close with my wife Evie. So anyway, it's a happy moment in this otherwise complex play.
Please excuse us for interrupting. We'll continue our conversation in a minute. Before we go back to the meat of your book, I have to ask you about one person that you list under acknowledgments, because it just kind of jumps off the page. Maureen Scalia. Where is that friendship from?
It's an important friendship. Justice Scalia and I were good friends. You know that wonderful holiday party at the National Gallery of Art for Christmas. They do this great party. We would always have dinner together at this, and I just kind of got along well with Justice Scalia. And in Maureen, I also had a great relationship with. She's terribly wonderful with my kids. They talk all sorts of things, perhaps even a little bit of politics as well, I would say. And Maureen I find to be a wise woman. That when I wasn't sure about some things, I would sometimes call her up and we'd go to lunch, and she would advise me. And plus, she's got a good sense of humor. We've been there for Thanksgiving. And one time, was funny. We spent the whole evening talking about Seinfeld. So most people don't think of Justice Scalia or Marine as talking about Seinfeld, but they're aficionados of it, and so we had good fun with that. But that is a very serious and heartfelt acknowledgement.
Again, there's so much in the book, and of course, one of the things you do in an interview is talk about a lot of different things, and then people can go buy the book if they're interested. I have to say that on page 89, and this goes to your style of writing, I gotta read some of it and then get you to react to it. It's all about Abraham Lincoln and his wife, which I found I've read a lot about Lincoln, but I have not seen it put together on a page like this. You say that Mary Todd was ambitious, cultured, plump, and witty. She also spoke French. And she was as determined as Lincoln himself, having handpicked him as destined for the White House. And you quote, Mr. Lincoln is to be president. This is her quote, is to be the president of the United States someday, she said. If I had not thought so, I would not have married him, for you can see he is not pretty.
That's Mary Todd Lincoln. I think, again, when I write, I try to give the full flavor of an actor in history, and she pushed him hard to become president. And without a woman like her, Lincoln may have ended up a small town country lawyer. And she had a bit of a temper. One time she took a broom and she chased him down the street, trying to hit him with it to get him to heel, as it were. It's funny that Lincoln was not always a nice man. I guess I could put it that way. In fact, Ossie and Evan and I had this very discussion about this. Lincoln didn't like the way she did not fit well into society of Washington, D.C. And she was prone to these moody fits. And then Lincoln took her to the windows of the White House on the second floor, and said, "Ma'am, look over at that asylum over there. That's where you're going to end up if you don't curtail or rein in your excessive feelings." But it was Mary Todd who pushed him to become president. And she was only going to marry someone who's going to become president. So that's what I was getting at there.
What do you think her impact was on him regarding the Civil War? Because she was from Kentucky and from the South.
Yeah, it's right, and it was her family that was being bloodied and beaten by the North. She was enough of a politician that she was able to withstand the kind of difficulty of seeing her own family being battered that way. It did not change how she felt. She was a good soldier, and she stuck with Abraham Lincoln on that policy question.
You go on that same page, and you say the marriage was an odd one, and in a number of ways the two couldn't have been more different. He grew up on dirt floors. She was waited on by enslaved people and attended finishing school. He was rumpled and disorganized, whether at home or at the office. She was neat and fastidious. He loved humor. She had none at all. She insisted upon servants. He would not keep a clerk. And if he were morose, she would be nasty and difficult.
It's quite a couple.
How did they last?
I think they lasted because it was a relationship of convenience and ambition. And what he did for her, she did for him. They propped each other up. They they had an eye to history. And this plump woman, this not very attractive woman, married this not very attractive man, but he would emerge as our greatest president along with Washington. But it was quite a couple, the two of them. But I think quite important to helping him continue to soldier on. I mean, there were times where, like such as during the Battle of the Wilderness, when the Union lost 60,000 men in 6 weeks, and Lincoln would walk the floors of the White House. He would be muttering and putting his hands on his sides like that, and he'd be saying, "I must have some relief from this anxiety, or it will kill me." And she kind of kept it from killing him, and she kept him strong when he was tempted to be weak. You know, he used to carry a penknife around, and he said, I weep and I cry when I'm in private, and I fear that I may cut myself one day. I get so morose by all this bloodshed.
In your note on sources, you have this sentence: I labored intensively to find novel and hidden insights about a subject otherwise obscure in the sea of historical information. Can you think of some things in the book that either have never been reported before, or you reported them in a different way?
Well, certainly the whole basis of the book, it's called The Lost Peace. That's not a topic one typically sees. And the fact that I wrote a whole book about how we lost the peace, and the fact that we could have won the peace and had a different outcome. I mean, you don't get from most people, including most historians, the notion that we could have let slavery die of a natural ebb and flow of events. I mean, I believe very strongly, and it's not a typical view, but I believe very strongly that we could have let slavery just die on its own. And this is what some of the players of the time thought. You know, I talk about J. Crittenden. This is another thing that is kind of new and relatively unique. I elevate J. Crittenden, who was a senator and also a governor and secretary of war. And Crittenden was the man of the consummate middle. And it was he who, more than anyone else, fought to keep this union together, fought to keep the union in a peaceful state, not a war state. He devised something called the Committee of 33 and the Committee of 13. Senior legislators, great statesmen, great diplomats. I mean, a fascinating assemblage. And they were to craft a policy to keep the peace. He was actually the man who thousands and thousands of people sent him letters every day calling for peace. And then in the Senate, they took a giant wheel, and it was signed by 13,000 women, and it was designed to keep the peace. And they rolled it down into the aisles of the Senate. And then the other thing about Crittenden is he was a stunning speaker. He gave his maiden speech, and Lincoln actually went into the Senate and watched that speech, and that's very atypical in politics, certainly at that level. So my resuscitating Crittenden and showing how he made such an impact and sought to make an even greater impact, that's, I don't want to say it goes against the grain of standard scholarship, but it's a different viewpoint.
You point out that they were meeting at the Willard Hotel,
Yeah.
and that Abraham Lincoln walked in there before he was inaugurated. But before we do that, if someone's never been to Washington, they always hear about the Willard Hotel. Where is it?
Well, it's a great question, and whenever I bring friends to Washington, and I take them around and give them a little tour, as it were. The Willard is right across the street from the Treasury Department of the White House. Brian, as you know, that's where people line up when they go to a Christmas party at the White House. But the Willard Hotel is this beautiful, elegant, grand hotel, and it stands there today. You can get a good lunch. You can spend the overnight there. It's a special place, and it's a special place because it was so intimately tied into history. And in the Willard Hotel, it was there where they devised the peace committee, the committee that was going to elevate peace. And this place had such stature, the Willard Hotel, that before everybody came, they were shining the chandeliers, they were cleaning the rooms. Lincoln ended up having an office in the Willard Hotel, and this was when the White House was right across the street. And then Crittenden convened this committee of peace, which again is relatively new in my pointing out its significance, and it was a fascinating committee. It had senators and governors. It had congressmen and ex-presidents. It had the statesmen of every kind, from east, from west, from north, from the south, and the Willard Hotel was where they convened everything. So I recommend that anyone who is in Washington go to the Willard, have a nice lunch, and read my book and get a little flavor of history.
So, what happened to the Crittenden Committee? Was it ever voted on?
It was voted on. And these two committees, the Committee of 13 and the Committee of 33. And you think legislative affairs these days, people say, oh, it's so terrible. It's the worst it's ever been. But it's not the worst it's ever been. If you look at the Crittenden Committee, they fought bitterly against each other as well as with each other to vote on different measures that would have kept the peace. Largely what they were trying to do was to craft a compromise that would keep slaves where they existed and make it impossible to have any new slaves. It's interesting on the question of abolition and slavery. We tend to think of slaves as just being everywhere, but in the West, particularly at this time of the lost peace, there were slaves, but 13 in this state, 18 in this state, 14 in this state. I mean, the numbers are minuscule and small. And one would have gotten the impression from reading the papers or from reading a history book today that the slaves were just overrunning the entire nation, when in fact they were circumscribed in the West. So yeah.
You don't have this specific list in the book, but I thought it would be interesting to get your reaction to the order and dates in which each Southern state left the Union. Of course, you talk about South Carolina on December the 20th, 1860, before the inauguration. But then I'm going to quickly go down the list. Mississippi, January 9. Florida, January 10. Alabama, January 11. Georgia, January 9. Louisiana, January 26. Texas, February the 1st. Virginia, April the 17th. Arkansas, May the 6th. Tennessee, May the 7th. North Carolina, May the 20th. They were the last one. When you hear those dates and hear those states, what comes to mind?
Well, I guess what comes to mind for me is the heavens were falling apart. I mean, it was something that terrified the Union and made them think that there was simply no way to reconcile with the South. And of course, the key date that would follow those dates would be at a little spit of land, a small little island called Fort Sumter. And so Crittenden couldn't get peace at the Committee of 33, couldn't get peace at the Committee of 13. And so it devolved then to this question of what would happen at this small little island called the Fort Sumter, which became the place where the fate of the Union would be decided. Would there be peace? Would there be war? Would they stick together or would they fall apart? And of course, we know that it became the locus of war. And in the end, that's what devolved us into this bloody state.
Do you have any thoughts about why South Carolina was first and North Carolina was last of the southern states to leave the Union?
Yeah, North Carolina had, by temperament and by design and maybe by the quirk of history, they were more pacific, as it were. They were not prone to blindly following the South. And South Carolina is a unique example where everyone else was still sort of hanging with the Union. South Carolina embarked on its own policy, and they were for their own state and their own country. And during Fort Sumter, when the North was saying that it was Major Robert Anderson at the time, he said, we will fight against the South if we have to, until the last drop of blood falls. But in South Carolina, they were standing on the rooftops. They were parading through, and it was a party atmosphere in a sense. They really wanted to have their own policy, their own country, their own state.
Please excuse us for interrupting. We'll continue our conversation in a minute. On page 37, and this seems to get to the nub of what we try to learn about Abraham Lincoln and this whole issue of slavery, I want to read back your words. You say Lincoln offered his reply in this situation he was talking about, but the founders, he contended, did not intend, quote, to declare all men equal in all respects, unquote. What they meant was that all men, black as well as white, quote, were equal in their inalienable right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, unquote. Soon the debate, these are your words, included the question of amalgamation, the mixing of races. The Democrats contended that Republicans wanted to, quote, vote and eat and sleep and marry with Negroes, unquote. Not so, insisted Lincoln. There was a natural disgust, he said, among nearly all whites at the idea of racial amalgamation, and the Republican Party opposed it as well. I'll complete the last sentence. But what the Republicans did not oppose was the fact that a black person was a human being. The Republican, in quotes, inculcate that the Negro is a man, that his bondage is cruelly wrong, and that the field of his oppression ought not to be enlarged. Did Lincoln ever change his mind about the way he looked at black folks?
I think he did. In the beginning, he was a consummate politician, where he didn't tie the Republican Party too heavily with the blacks or the Negroes, as they used at the time. But as the war continued, and as the war raged, and as they went from 1 year to a second year to a third year to a fourth year, as there were such titanic struggles as Gettysburg or Antietam, as that continued, it began to wear on Lincoln. And I think Lincoln himself grew as not only a politician with greater arts of politics, but in his heart and in his soul and in his fiber, he began to sort of see the cruel inhumanity of slavery. And I end the book with a phrase where I talk about a black man who was a slave, Houston Holloway, and he said at the end of the war, "I am free. I'm free as a bird." And I think Lincoln embraced that and came to have it in his own heart. And he was a changed man. Of course, he didn't make it. He was shot down by an assassin, tragically. But he grew as a politician, and I think that's the nub of what I was getting at in that phrase.
Back to April 1865, a book I assume is still in print?
Still in print, still sells. I still get, I've written a bunch of other books, and I think very fine books. But April 1865 is the one that has really seized the attention of the reading public. And it sells well. I sign it at Christmas time. It's a book that I think is it's a special book. It's a unique book. It's a wonderful book. It's as fine as I could write. But having said that, I think my other books are wonderful books. One thing I do, which is, again is it's wonderful if you have the chance to do this as an historian. I write about the founders in my book, The Great Upheaval. I write about World War II and the Holocaust in my book, 1944. And that's a book that I feel is every bit as strong as my other books. And I try to bring the Holocaust to life as much as possible, so that we see how it happened, how it affected people, and just the tragedy of a whole race being eviscerated by the Nazis. So I try to write across different sections, different subjects. In effect, I think what I try to do is I try to show what leadership is and what tragedy is in policy making. At 9/11, I got in touch with, or actually George Bush got in touch with me, and we became very good friends. And we used to lunch in the White House, and I'd come for dinner or just to sit down with him, and we talk about leaders. And that was an interesting component of my writing career, to see a leader from the inside and in flesh, as opposed to what you put together on paper with pen and pencil. Although there is no such thing as pen and pencil anymore, but I tell my kids to use it anyway.
What did you tell George Bush about leadership that you can remember?
I think one of the things we talked about was keeping one's head and wits about them and not being rash in making decisions. And one thing that the president asked me about that I thought was very interesting is he asked, why are Grant's memoirs so revered? And he said, and this was very insightful on his part. He said, is it because Grant is just famous, or is it because he really did write memoirs that were that good? And another thing that
what was your feeling about the Grant memoir?
I thought that Grant was probably right. I love Grant's memoirs. They're seen as in the canon of memoirs. They're seen as really one of the very best. But I think there's an element where, because of the reputation of it, that's why it's seen as so great as well. And another funny incident I had with Bush, where we talked about Kissinger, and he said he likes to invite Kissinger to his events at the White House, because then Kissinger will then go and talk with all, as Bush put it, all his fancy friends, and he'll talk about how smart Bush is. So that was a funny little insight.
Can you give us a ballpark figure of how many books of 1865 sold?
A lot.
I assume hundreds of thousands.
Yeah.
Why is it authors are so afraid to give the numbers on books sold?
We're a timid bunch. We're a timid bunch. I'm going to leave it at that. We're a timid bunch.
Back to the book, and one chapter that got my attention, and over the years in the books that I've read and interviewed, I have never talked much about John Brown. And you have, right out of the box, you give the John Brown story. And I want you to tell us as much as you can about him and why he went to Lawrence, Kansas.
Yeah, this John Brown story is a very important story. And personally, I changed my own views about John Brown after writing about him. And, you start with the question of, who was John Brown? Was he a madman? Was he crazy? Or was he a visionary who was seeing into the future and pulling and tugging us into the future? He looked like a mad prophet, or a Moses who was crossing the Red Sea. He had failed at everything he had done in life, 13 ventures, until he decided that his mission in life and his role in life, handed to him by God, no doubt, was that he would end the curse of slavery. And he assembled what in effect was an army headed by him, and they even put together a legislature put together by him, and he just was horrified at slavery, and he was horrified in Lawrenceville, Kansas, when there was a failure of the Union to do more to end slavery, and so he just lost his mind, in a sense, over that, and he put together his own little army, and he expected they would they would come to join his crusade. He sat down on a rock in the woods one night with Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, and he said, "Be like the bees who come to the hive, and help me in my struggle." And Douglass said, "I don't believe you'll survive this, and I don't want that to be my fate." He met with Harriet Tubman. He met with Theodore Parker. He met with all these great intellectuals who went to schools like Harvard and Yale, and they became acolytes of John Brown's. And the story of John Brown's fascinating. He eventually decided then he would start the war. He just needed a few more men to join his cause. Well, only 13 came. And one night, looking up in the sky, he saw the moon hanging low. And he decided this is the night to strike. So he went to a place called Harper's Ferry with his little ragtag army. And they killed a man. And the first man they killed was actually a free slave. And they had a bloody battle there in this Harper's Ferry. And the whites were so terrified by what was happening, is that when the B&O Railroad went chugging by, the whites in the cars threw out pieces of paper saying, "We are being attacked by an army of blacks." And the symbols of this are really rich and important.
Before you go on with Harper's Ferry, let me take you back to Lawrence for a moment, because you write some things that kind of give the reader an example of how strong he was. He said, as this scene played out, dozens had gathered beneath the heated air and the flying pieces of burning wood. All gaped in astonishment at the choking smoke and the flames now roaring out of control. Some of the streets were littered with household items, cooking utensils, heirlooms and photographs, bureaus and bedding, all gathered in haste and piled randomly on the streets. The residents of Lawrence shuddered as they heard the pounding of the Missourian bushwhackers' feet and their bark commands filling the air. I can go on, but were there people killed in Lawrence before he got to Harper's Ferry later?
There were, and it was a battle, not of huge proportions, but of symbolic proportions. It was quite significant, and they in effect had taken over, and in that little struggle there, the governor of in Lawrenceville, his own place was attacked as well. So that was a symbol which really galvanized John Brown. Now, the one other thing I want to say about John Brown is he grew in stature as his fate diminished. When he was captured at Harper's Ferry, he was captured by, of all people, Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee, of course, was the man who Abraham Lincoln selected as to be the head of the Union armies, although Lee said no. And then so Brown was captured. He was tried in a Virginia court, and he was on a cot because he had suffered wounds when they captured Harper's Ferry. And he was in prison, and from prison, he was writing little notes to the world, saying that he is of good cheer, and he feels good things will happen. And then he was sentenced to be hung. And in this scene of when he was hung would echo through the ages in a sense. He would go up one step after another, getting to the top of the gallows. And in the hills around were thousands of soldiers and citizens and people watching this momentous piece of history playing out. And then finally, Brown looked at his jailer and he said, "You must guide me through this, as I am a little unsteady." And they pulled the lever. In went the body. The rope was not long enough, so he hung there for 13 minutes, much longer than he should have. And then when he died, his spirit, in a sense, lived more than ever, and he I believe would be a spark that would set this motion of a war into being.
A couple of quick things just to check. Harper's Ferry is about an hour, 15 minutes or so from Washington by car in West Virginia.
Yeah.
And you point out in the book that he was married twice and had 20 children, and 6 of his children were with him on the raid in Lawrence, Kansas.
Yeah, and not only that, but he lost several of his children were killed. And not in Lawrenceville, but the one in Harper's Ferry, his son got badly wounded and was whimpering and crying because he was in such pain. And his father looked at him and said, "Die like a man."
Last story before we let you go is actually one of your first chapters, chapter number 2, a man named Silas Jackson. Why did he deserve so much attention from you?
What I wanted to do was, and I went to the original sources for that, and they were fascinating. I wanted to give the life of a slave and to let people see just what it was like to be a slave. I mean, how they didn't own things, how they worked their fingers to the bone. And one thing that I find just a magnificently rich example of what they endured, but also the spirit of how the slaves who endured could. Where the slaves were on one side of the Potomac and then on the other side, and they would sing to each other during Christmas time. I thought that was a fitting way to explain just what it was like to be in chains as a slave.
Who was Tom Ashby?
Tom Ashby was a member of the family, and he was there to again give a sense of what it was like for the slaves to endure the life they lived. The other thing about Ashby is he was also a cruel man, and he made the slaves suffer for being what they were.
Well, you quote Silas Jackson, the enslaved man, who was enslaved by Tom Ashby, as saying, "A meaner man was never born, brutal, wicked, and hard. Ashby ruled with an iron fist, and all the enslaved people lived in terror of him." In the end, how did the word of Silas Jackson get published?
It got published because it was part of a collection of letters that were handed down, and what's so rich about them is that they just ring with humanity, and they would describe what they wore, what they did during holidays, how they were able to move about on a Sunday, how if they were out of line, they were beaten cruelly. I just wanted to give a sense of what their lives were from day to day, because this was the subject. We fought for two reasons. Abraham Lincoln wanted to keep the Union together, and we fought to end servitude. It's a struggle that continues to this day. But having said that, back then it was a way of life, an accepted way of life, but in their tiny little actions, it's enlifting, in a sense, to sort of see how they took a life that was difficult and cruel and hard, and still gave it humanity.
I want our folks listening to know that if they are interested in listening to our 24-year-old interview on April 8, 1865, you can find it either on Jay Winik's Wikipedia page. There's a little box there that has all of your appearances on C-SPAN, or you can go to our video archives and watch it. But thank you, Jay Winik, for this book, 1861, The Lost Peace. We appreciate your time and your extra effort to tell us this story.
Brian, I immensely enjoyed the our first interview. Then we had a second interview, and I was telling my son, you kind of watch out for this guy Brian Lamb. He has tough questions. He goes where the evidence takes him. He doesn't have an agenda except for enriching the policies of the United States, and we are all richer for it because of what you've done in your work. And I'm pleased and happy and humbled to have been part of your family.
Thank you, Jay Winik. Good luck on that health situation. Hope you live another 25 years at least.
I hope so too. I think we'll get there.
Thanks for tuning into this week's Booknotes Plus podcast. If you have a moment, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback will help others discover the program. And don't forget to share this episode with friends and family. For the latest on new episodes, schedule updates, and more, follow us on X @C-SPAN Radio.